Hello, welcome to Physical Geography 252. This is Lab 6 Atmospheric Pressure. I'm on page 43 in your lab manual. And you'll see the key terms. Make sure you know all these key terms for the hand-in assignment at the end. And then we're going to start with the introduction. So we're going to be talking about how the relationships between pressure and wind and how they impact the landscape and create air movements. So we're mostly going to be focusing on pressure. And so pressure is one of the 4 variables of weather that we cannot feel. So the other 3 variables of weather are temperature, humidity, and air movement. So we can feel temperature, we can feel the humidity in the air, and we can feel the air movement or the wind, but you can't really feel pressure. So if you remember from Lab 3, the atmosphere is held to the Earth's surface by gravity. And the weight caused by that pull from gravity is known as pressure. And the force of pressure is strongest closest to the Earth's surface. So that's why when you're closest to the Earth's surface, that's where you're going to feel the strongest force of pressure. And then as you go up in altitude, pressure is going to get weaker because there's not as many gas molecules as you go up. And then atmospheric pressure is measured in units called millibars. And the pressure at sea level is 1,013.25 millibars. So that's what it is at sea level, and remember, as you go up, pressure is going to decrease in altitude. So if you look at the bottom of page 43, you'll see a formula there. So the factors that influence atmospheric pressure include temperature, density, and pressure, and they're displayed in the formula you see called the ideal gas law. So the ideal gas law basically shows you the relationships between all these factors. And so if one of these variables changes, then the other 2 are going to be affected as well. So if pressure changes, then the temperature and density is affected. Whereas the temperature changes, then the density and pressure is affected. So they all have this relationship and they all change when another one changes. And then talking about density, density is the mass of matter in a given volume. So for gas, density changes a lot because gas in the atmosphere doesn't really have a container. So the density of gas changes in the atmosphere as you go up because it can fill any volume that it wants. So now we're going to be talking about mapping pressure. So when you're mapping pressure, it's going to look kind of like a contour line map for elevation. It's going to look like this. So if you've ever seen a map for elevation, it has these contour lines going across it, but for pressure we call them isolines or isobars. We need to edit this part. Okay. So pressure is measured using an instrument called a barometer. So that's important. You need to know pressure is measured using an instrument called a barometer. And like we said earlier, it's measured in units called millibars. And it's displayed using isobars. So what an isobar is, it's a line that joins points of equal atmospheric pressure. So if you look at this map, and this is in your lab manual on page 45. So looking at this map, these are your isobars, and each bar or each line represents one pressure, one number of pressure. So this one right here is 1,012. The entire line, anywhere on this line across the U.S. is going to have a pressure of 1,012. Any point on this line across the U.S. is going to be 1,008. So right here, this is 1,008 is what the pressure is. Right here is 1,004. So, and this line goes across Alabama. So in Alabama, on this particular day, the air pressure was 1,004 millibars. So this is how your ISO lines work. So remember, one line equals shows a line that joins equal points of atmospheric pressure. And so looking at this line, looking at this map, you can see where your high pressure is and your low pressure. And that you can look at using troughs and ridges. So troughs show low pressure. So if you're looking at a map and the ISO lines start to kind of drooping like this is where your low pressure is. Or if you're looking at your map and you see where your ISO lines start to go upwards like this. It's a ridge. So this ridge is for high pressure, troughs are for low pressure. So looking back at the map in our book, there's actually a trough right here. So you can see the ISO lines are going downward, and so this is where your low pressure is creating a trough. And then we have high pressure is concentrated up here because this is our highest pressure up here is 1024, and our low pressure is going to be down here closer to sea level at 1000 millibars. And then knowing where your ISO lines are also shows you the direction of wind. So wind travels from high pressure down to low. So wherever the high pressure is, the wind is going to go towards the low pressure. So your direction of wind is downward going this way. So if you want to fill this in on your diagram on your book, go ahead and do that. So then if you look on the next page, page 46, you have a diagram that looks like this. And so what it wants you to do as an exercise is to draw your own ISO lines. So it gives you points of pressure, and you have to draw a line where that line, it has the equal same amount of pressure in that whole line, if that makes sense. So I kind of started doing it for you. So this is what mine looks like. So it wants you to draw lines in intervals of 4 millibars. So I started with 1004 millibars, and then I did 1008 and 1012, and if you keep going, you'll do 1016 and so on, adding 4 millibars each time. So I started with 1004, and as you can see, the points inside are 1002 and 1003. And so I drew 1004 around it, and then you have 1005 here, and then my 1008 line goes right through the point that says 1008, because everywhere on this line is going to be 1008 millibars of pressure. So if you want to fill in your map, you can go ahead and do that. Okay. Now we're on page 47, talking about atmospheric pressure and altitude. So, like we said, the density of gas molecules is greatest at sea level because all of your gas molecules are focused towards the ground closest to the Earth's surface. And then as you go up in altitude, it kind of thins out. Your gas molecules really spread out. So this is an example in your lab manual. So like we said, pretend these little red circles are your gas molecules, and they're really concentrated towards the Earth's surface. And as you go up, they start to spread out and get less dense or less tightly packed. So they spread out as you go up because there's less gravity pulling it down. So your lab manual says at 5.6 kilometers from the Earth's surface, if you were to go up 5.6 kilometers, 50% of the total mass of the atmosphere would be above you and 50% would be below you. So at 5.6 kilometers, you would be at sort of where the center of the mass of the atmosphere is. And then as you increase, going up 5.6 kilometers, the atmospheric mass decreases by half. So if you look at your table, this is page 48, you have at sea level 100% of the atmosphere's mass is above you and nothing's below you because you're standing on the Earth's ground. And then if we go up 5.6 kilometers off the Earth's surface, 50% of the atmosphere is above us and 50% is below us. And then if we go up another 5.6, so if we're at 11.2 kilometers off the Earth's surface, we have 25% of the atmosphere's mass above us and 75% below us. So if you go up another 5.6 kilometers, you're going to divide again by half. So half of 25 is 12.5. So 12.5% is above us and 87.5% is below us. And remember, this is the atmosphere's mass. So this is the concentration of the gas molecules. So then if you want to keep filling this out, just keep dividing it by half. So the next one, if you're at 22.4 kilometers, it's going to be 6.25% above you and 93.75% below you. And then looking over here at the atmospheric pressure, so So we know at sea level the atmospheric pressure is 1013.2 millibars, and then if we go up 5.6 kilometers, it divides in half, and it gives you 506.6 millibars, and we go up another 5.6 kilometers, it divides in half again. So I know this is a lot of numbers, but the next one would be 253.3 millibars, and if you want to fill out the rest of the chart, just keep dividing it in half again. Okay. Next thing we're going to talk about is the wind direction and the Coriolis effect. So the movement of air, or wind, depends on three factors. Those factors are the pressure gradient force, the Coriolis effect, and friction. So first we're going to talk about the pressure gradient force. So the pressure gradient is the rate of change of atmospheric pressure between 2 points at the same elevation. So what that means, if you have 2 points at the same elevation, and it's basically measuring how much pressure changes in between these 2 points. So you have two types of pressure gradient force. So you have a strong gradient and a weak gradient. So we have our 2 points, and let's say it's over a short distance. If there's a lot of pressure change, so if the number of the pressure changes a lot over a short distance, the gradient is going to be strong because so much has changed over this little distance. But let's say we have 2 points that are very far spread apart, and the pressure really didn't change that much at all. It's going to be a weak pressure gradient because not much really changed over this large distance. And so the way that that's shown is that, so here's an example in your lab. So looking at how it changes, you have your strong gradient of pressure, remember, is over a short distance and a lot of change. So right here is a short distance, but a lot has changed. So this is a strong pressure gradient. Right here, this is a long distance, but not that much is changing between this long distance. So this is going to be a weak pressure gradient because not a lot is changing over a far distance. So if you want to label that in your lab manual, you can. So we have weak pressure gradient, strong gradient, this is another strong gradient, and this is a weak one. Or it's more weak in the middle here because it kind of gets stronger right here. Okay, so then another thing to remember is that the pressure gradient force, remember, it causes winds to move from high pressure to low. So the wind always moves from high and the wind goes towards low pressure. So always remember, wind goes from high to low pressure. So that's the direction of your wind, is always flowing from high to low pressure. Okay. The second factor that influences the movement of wind, actually, okay, yeah, we're fine. The second factor that influences the movement of wind is the Coriolis effect. So now I'm on page 49, if you're following along. So the Coriolis effect is the deflection of free-moving objects to the right in the northern hemisphere and to the left in the southern hemisphere. And so the reason it depends on what hemisphere you're in is because of the rotation of the Earth. So as the Earth is spinning, it's affecting our wind and what direction the wind moves. So if you're in the northern hemisphere, your air is deflected to the right. If you're in the southern hemisphere, your air is deflected to the left. So that's important to know. And then the pressure gradient force determines the wind direction, while the Coriolis effect deflects the perpendicular movement. So that sounds kind of crazy, but basically the pressure gradient force, what we talked about, determines your wind direction. So we know that the wind goes from high to low pressure, but with the Coriolis effect, it's talking about how wind moves up and down. So if you look at this figure that's in your lab manual, the Coriolis affects whether air moves upwards or whether it moves downwards. So there's two types of cells that form from the Coriolis effect, and that depends whether they go up or down. So if you have high pressure, so here your H stands for high pressure. So if you have high pressure, your air is going downwards, so it's descending. If you have low pressure, your air is going upwards and it's ascending. And then your high pressure forms areas called anticyclones. So high pressure is called anticyclones, where low pressure is just a cyclone. So go ahead and make a note of that, that's really important. So we have our high pressure, which air goes down. We have our low pressure, where air goes up. And then depending on what hemisphere you're in, depends on what direction the wind spins. So if you're in the northern hemisphere, so let's go ahead and look at the next figure on page 51. You have this figure. So you have your northern hemisphere, here's our equator, which is 0 degrees, and here's our southern hemisphere. So if you remember, our high pressure is an anticyclone, our low pressure is just a cyclone, and it doesn't matter what hemisphere you're in. High pressure is always an anticyclone, low pressure is always a cyclone. Now depending what hemisphere you're in does depend what way it rotates. It's either going to go clockwise or it's going to go counterclockwise. So if you're in the northern hemisphere, wind is deflected to the right. So cyclones, where's our cyclone? This is our cyclone. It circulates counterclockwise. So go ahead and make a note on your figure. Cyclones with low pressure go counterclockwise. Anticyclones go clockwise. So this one is clockwise, this is counterclockwise. And then for the southern hemisphere, it's the opposite because wind is deflected to the left. So we have our cyclone here, it goes clockwise. This one goes counterclockwise. So these two spin clockwise as the arrows point, and these two go counterclockwise as the arrows point. So that's basically how the Coriolis effect determines which way the wind spins. And then our very last factor that influences the movement of air and pressure is friction. So friction from the Earth's surface slows wind movement, so it's slowing down how fast our wind is blowing, and it reduces the influence of the Coriolis effect. So without friction, our Coriolis effect is spinning almost like a hurricane, like it's spinning very intensely. But with friction, it slows down how tight the hurricane is spinning, or the cyclone. So with friction, instead of going towards the center, it's probably going to go out a little bit more. So looking at figure 6.2 right here on page 52, so you can see how the different factors influence your wind. So the red arrow is for pressure gradient, your blue arrow is the Coriolis effect, and the purple arrow is friction, and then the black arrow is what way your wind is going. So you can see how the three of them affect which direction the wind is going. So your pressure gradient or your Coriolis effect kind of balance each other out. They're kind of pulling against each other in opposite directions, while the friction is slowing it down. So as your friction is slowing it down, your wind isn't going so much in that cyclone shape anymore. So that's pretty much everything for this lab. When you do your hand-in assignment, it's got quite a few figures for you to write on. So make sure you answer the multiple choice. And then for this one, you're going to be showing how the wind looks with just the pressure gradient. This one is pressure gradient and the Coriolis effect, and this one is all three factors, how they affect your wind. So make sure you label them the right way. And then this one wants you to show low pressure and high pressure, so just make sure you label them out to the side, make sure it's nice and clear and we can see it. But that's it for this lab, so thank you for watching.